In this part, I'm introducing the impairments of property, plant, and equipment. Most operating assets are subject to the impairments. In the chapter 9, the inventory impairments, we use the LCM or LCNRV to write down the value of inventory. PPE is also subject to the impairments when these events happen. So to recognize the impairments of property, plant, and equipment, we should first review the events that may result in the possible impairment. And then we are going to do the impairment test by compare the book value of the assets with the sum of the expected future cash flow from the long-term assets. So if the sum of the expected future cash flow is less than the book value, then an impairment has occurred. In the simple word, the value of the assets is overstated. The next is to determine the amount of impairment. So the amount basically is the book value subtract the fair value. In this chart, it shows the procedures for impairment. The first is to compare the book value, also called carrying amount, with the sum of the expected future cash flow from this asset. If the book value is greater than the future cash flow, the assets should be impaired. Otherwise, no impairments. The next step is the amount. Depends on the purpose of the assets, the amount may be different. So if the asset is still held for use by the firm, so the amount of impairment loss is the difference between the book value and the fair value. Because the book value after impairment will be updated. So the depreciation expense will be updated accordingly. And also, there's no restoration of impairment loss permit. If the asset is held for disposal, the impairment loss is the difference between the book value and the fair value less cost of disposal. The fair value less cost of disposal is very similar to the net realizable value. Because the asset is held for disposal, no more depreciation recognized. But the restoration of impairment loss is permitted. In this example, we will check out how to determine the impairment loss. So the book value we are given is 600,000, which is the difference between cost 800,000 and the 200,000 accumulated depreciation. We're also given the sum of the future cash flow from this asset is $650,000. Then we compare the book value with the sum of the expected future cash flow. So the book value is less than the future cash flow. That means no impairment should be recognized. The asset was not overstated. The next one, we just changed the expected future cash flow to a smaller number, 580. So the book value is still 600. Expected future cash flow now is 580. That means assets was overstated by $20,000. That means this asset passed recoverability test. We can move on to the next step. How much should be recognized as impairment? It is determined by the difference between book value and the fair value. The book value is 600. The fair value is given 525. So the impairment is $75,000. Keep in mind, we have total 3 values available. One is the expected future cash flow. This is cash flow specifically generated from these assets. The next one is book value, or the carrying amount of the assets. Then the fair value. So the first two, we will do a recoverability test. If it passed, we move to the second step, measurement of the loss. So the journal entry to recognize this impairment loss is by debit loss on impairment 75,000. At the same time, we're going to write down the book value of the assets by recognize the accumulated depreciation 75,000. As we learned from the flowchart, the assets held for disposal is treated as inventory. We should report the assets at the lower of cost or net realizable value. So net realizable value actually is the fair value of disposal subtract the cost of disposal. And these assets can be written down or up. The assets held for disposal are allowed to be written up, but the maximum is the carrying amount before the impairment. And also the firm should report any losses or gains regarding the write-down or write-up as part of the income from continuing operation, because the impairment or write-up are continuing procedures for property, plant, and equipment.